So we're going to talk about the brain stem in this section. So we're going to begin with the midbrain, letter C, on your outline. So you can see that our brain stem contains these four structures. We're going to go through them one at a time. So let's find our midbrain. The midbrain is going to be in green here, and this is the posterior side of our midbrain, which you can see has four bumps, and it has the anterior side has these this sort of column-like structure called cerebral peduncles. So what I'm going to do is we're going to look at this from the mid-sagittal section to explain what it looks like. So we're actually going to go up and take a look at, let's go ahead and take a look at the real brain. So the midbrain is separated by a groove called the cerebral aqueduct. So this groove you see here, that's our cerebral aqueduct. So our midbrain is this chunk that I'm kind of just outlining here with my cursor. Okay? So the cerebral aqueduct is going to allow the cerebrospinal fluid that's created here in our third ventricle, and also the cerebrospinal fluid that's created in our lateral ventricles, to flow down. So this is a little canal to flow. And then we're going to reach the fourth ventricle, which actually also contains a choroid plexus, which also makes cerebrospinal fluid. All right, so the anterior portion. So let's take a look at this generally, just like a flat square area, nothing special going on here. That's called our cerebral peduncles. All right, and then the back here is going to be this sort of small sliver back here. That's actually our two bumps. We have a superior colliculus and then a second bump called our inferior colliculus. So since your outline starts with the posterior side, let's look at that. So let's take a look at this. It's a little simpler. So here's our cerebral aqueduct. Here's our cerebral peduncles in front. Behind our cerebral aqueduct, we have our two bumps here. So let me explain. The posterior side of our midbrain contains those four bumps. Let's just go quickly look back at these four bumps, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. The two upper bumps, they're both called superior colliculi, and the two inferior bumps are called inferior colliculi. Now, the word colliculi is plural, single is colliculus. Okay, so let's go back up and take a look at our model. You see how there's an upper bump here? That's going to be the superior colliculus. And then there's an inferior bump, that's our inferior colliculus. So when you have a mid-sagittal section, you only have two of the four bumps visible. So functions. The superior colliculus is involved in tracking, your eye tracking, and your visual reflexes. So let's say that you are looking at the television, and then there's something in your peripheral vision, something moving, right? You will automatically turn your attention, your head will turn, your eyes will turn to that motion, and that is because of this portion of your midbrain. It also sort of is where your gaze rests when you're sort of not thinking about anything. It's what you're looking at. So the evolutionary protective mechanism here is that you want to pay attention to anything that's moving in the periphery of your vision, because this is something that could have been an animal or some kind of predator or some kind of, even a neighbor that's sort of angry at you, so that you can turn your attention to fight it or to run away from it, right? The inferior colliculus, so that's what's visual reflexes for superior colliculus. The same concept is for the inferior colliculus, except this is going to be for auditory reflexes. So if you hear a loud noise, you're going to turn your head towards that loud noise to pay attention to it. You're going to identify which ear it's coming from and turn in that direction. The startle reflex, just everything involved in jumping and maybe even doing a little bit of a scream. Your hands and your arms kind of go out a little bit. That's all the startle reflex that's here too. All right, so those two. So all four of those bumps together, you guys, are called the corpora quadrigemina, which is bolded in this number 1. Number 2, the cerebral peduncle. So this general sort of area here, that's not much is going on. This is going to be our region, which is going to allow the upper part of our brain to talk to the rest of our brainstem. So notice that if I wanted messages to go up and down, there's no really good place to do it except for right here, right? So this is going to be the job of our cerebral peduncles, is to allow messages to travel from our spinal cord up and messages from our cerebrum down. All right, so it's a relay station, right? Up and down, to and from the brain to the spinal cord. Okay, next part of our brainstem will be the pons and the cerebellum. So I'm just going to turn the page here. So letter D, I start with the cerebellum, which is this really large brown structure in your model. Let's go ahead and take a look at your diagram. So this is your cerebellum. And you can see that the cerebellum is quite a large portion of your brain. It's about 11% of your brain. And it's going to have the fourth ventricle, which is right here. And then this guy is the choroid plexus of your fourth ventricle, right? So the fourth ventricle is situated sort of between the cerebellum and the pons. So the pons is this outward projecting structure here. This is a very exaggerated pons. The real human brain's pons is not that big. So anyways, the cerebellum has these structures associated with it. So if you look at the cerebellum, let me show you an actual cerebellum here. It doesn't look very pretty, but the ridges you can see on it are quite distinct. So instead of calling them gyri, like we do with the cerebrum, we're going to call them folia, right? So the word folia is used to describe those ridges. And the cerebellum has two hemispheres, just like your cerebrum. So we can see there's a right and left hemisphere. And then in the center, it's connected by something called the central vermis. So this is an old word for worm, or worm-like. So that looks like a worm in the middle. All right, inside, if we were to section our cerebellum, we would find white matter branching in a very distinct pattern that looks like branches of a tree. So that branching pattern of white matter is called the arbor vitae, this term right here, tree of life. Okay, so what the cerebellum in terms of function is used for is to smooth out and really have a large role in our motor, so our skeletal muscle movement of the body. So it's the first to receive input from the motor cortex for intended movement. So when you want to, let's say, reach your hand out to grab a pencil, right, that first start initiates in your brain. The brain will send those sort of impulses to the cerebellum. The cerebellum then is going to have to get input from the rest of your body. So if you look at the second sentence, the cerebellum receives information input from proprioceptors and sends a message back to the cortex on how to resolve intended movement with the current position. So let's explain proprioceptors. Proprioceptors are sensory receptors that are in your muscles, they're in your joints, and they're in your tendons and ligaments, and they can tell you the position of your body. So if you close your eyes and I ask you, what's the position of your left hand right now, or your left arm, you could easily tell me if your elbow was bent and how bent it was. You can tell me if your fingers are flexed or relaxed, or you can tell me where your wrist is in space. And this is because all that information from those joints will come into the brainstem, into the cerebellum, and your cerebellum will tell your brain where your body is. And so if you wanted to reach your hand out to grab a pencil, your brain needs to know, well, where is my starting point, right? Where is my hand and arm and shoulder? And then how much do I have to extend my shoulder joint, my elbow joint, my wrist, my fingers? How much, how far do I need to do that? How forcefully do I need to grab the pencil in order to keep it in my hand? So there's a lot of information zipping back and forth, and a lot of calculation going on in your brain in relatively simple movements. And so the cerebellum is responsible for smoothing out and making these movements seemingly effortless, right? Since it has this role in your voluntary skeletal muscle contraction, it also has a role in your motor memory. So when you learn to ride a bike, when you learn to ride a skateboard, when you learn to play piano, these motor skills that you acquire through your life, right, that is largely due to the cerebellum's function. So if you look at letter E, if we look at what happens if your cerebellum has dysfunction, then we can lose our motor control. Your walking, which is your gait, may be unsteady. You might have tremors, you might have jerky movements and slurred speech. So these cerebellar dysfunctions can be caused by many etiologies or causes. MS is muscular sclerosis. Hereditary, they can be caused by infections or tumors or trauma or some kind of poison like a drug, some kind of toxin, vitamin deficiency. So just so you have an idea of like when your cerebellum doesn't work, then you have problems with motor movements of the body. Okay, so the pons, let's talk quickly about the pons. The pons here is a little bridge. Pons literally means bridge, that allows fibers to reach into the cerebellum to access the cerebellum, and then from the cerebellum, the pons will send messages up or down to the spinal cord or up to the brain. Let me show you another image of the pons. So this is a good image because it tells number 12 is the pons. Because I can see the pons, the fibers reaching back into my cerebellum on both sides, right? So the fibers of the pons are gathering information, they're taking the electrical impulses from the cerebellum, and they're moving them forward to the brainstem so that the brainstem can either go, the information go up or down. So the pons is a bridge to the cerebellum. Now lastly, we talk about the medulla oblongata. This is right here, right? So this is this kind of most inferior or most caudal portion of our brainstem. It doesn't look like much. It has a lot of jobs though. So let's begin with the structures. Number one is the pyramids. So the pyramids are actually rectangles. This and this, those are pyramids. It seems kind of strange to call them pyramids, but there's a reason for that. So I'm going to show you this picture. When your frontal lobe, right? Remember that motor cortex, the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe initiates movement of your body. The neurons from this motor cortex are going to travel down, right? Of course, because they have to send the information from your brain down to the spinal cord and then to your skeletal muscle. So you can see the neurons, the long axons traveling down the brain, traveling through the spinal cord, through the brainstem. And then what happens here is very interesting. The two hemispheres of your brains, some of the fibers, not all you can see, but a lot of the fibers will actually cross over, right? So maybe the right hemisphere of your brain, these fibers that control the muscles of your body will cross over to the left side. And the left hemisphere of your brain will do the same thing. So what's interesting, right, and maybe some of you guys knew this, that the different hemispheres of your brain control opposite sides of your body. And this is the reason why, because there's a physical crossing over. So you guys should know the term decussation of the pyramids. And these neurons, I think I forgot to say this, these neurons are called pyramidal cells. So the neurons themselves look like a pyramid. They have a big body that looks like a triangle, and they have a very long axon. So these pyramidal cells cross, and that's called decussation of the pyramids. So coming back up, right, that's why these are called pyramids, is because those motor neurons are traveling in this region of the medulla oblongata. The crossing over takes place internally. You don't see a physical cross from the outside, but that does happen here in the medulla oblongata, okay? So those are pyramids. Then another term here is an anterior median fissure. See how we have a groove that begins in our medulla? This is going to be called the anterior median fissure. It's going to be continuous. The spinal cord has been cut away here, but the spinal cord looks exactly like this. It has an anterior median fissure that runs all the way down the spinal cord. Number two, the olives. So if you look carefully where number 8 is pointing to, there's a bump here on the side, and there's another bump here. Those are both called olives. And olives are going to be a relay station for proprioception, right? So proprioception coming in from the body, it'll come here to the olives, and the olives will send the message towards the cerebellum. And then we're going to have the different functions of the medulla. So The medulla oblongata is a very critical area. The whole brain stem is a very critical area of the brain. So when you think about what the brain does, a lot of times we think about thinking and emotions and memory, and that's all very, very important. Those are all the upper cerebrum jobs. What does the brain stem do? The brain stem takes care of just all those processes that are important for sustaining life that you don't think about. It's about maintaining your blood pressure. It's about your breathing rate. It's about knowing how deeply or forcefully or shallow to breathe. It's about maintaining your pH. It's about maintaining your heartbeat. Maybe I mentioned that, but it's very basic life-sustaining reflexes and monitoring of your body. So when your brain stem has dysfunctions, it's very dangerous and it's life-threatening. When you have problems with your upper part, the cerebrum, you might have memory problems, you might have emotional problems, you might have PTSD, but that is not going to be life-threatening. So the brain stem, the functions of it is to sustain life in these ways that are very, very critical and important. So I hope you understand that. So I just wanted to point out some of the features of the medulla. So if you look at functions, cardiac center, vasomotor center, respiratory center, reflexes, those are all really important for life. Swallowing, hiccuping, coughing, sneezing, right? If you didn't have those reflexes, you might get something caught in your throat and die from choking or different things like that. So the question I have here to wrap up this lecture is, when are you dead? Which is not a happy thought, but what modern medicine has provided us is survivor. We can survive in a hospital. Our heart, if it stops, there's a machine that can help you beat the heart. If you stop breathing, there's a machine that can help you breathe. So death, if you are in critical condition in the hospital, they can actually keep you alive in these different ways. However, there must be a measure of death, right? If your body's not responding, then how do you determine if someone is dead? And so what they're using nowadays is brain death. And what they're testing for in whether you're brain dead or not is these brain stem reflexes. Because if your brain stem is damaged, then there's no way that you can come off a breathing machine and come off a heart-lung machine and just live your everyday life, because you're always going to be required to be on a machine to just sustain your body's core homeostatic mechanisms. Anyhow, so what they do is they actually will take you off a breathing machine and they look for a gasp for air, because that gasp for air when you're not breathing is a brainstem reflex. So for people who do gasp for air, they say, right, that your brainstem is functioning and that you are not brain dead. But if they take you off the breathing machine and you do not gasp for air, then that is the hallmark of brain death. So that's how important this brainstem is. All right, so we are done with the medulla oblongata. And let's just look at our diagram just to wrap up here. All right, so not a lot of information on our diagram, but we can see that this is our pons, this is our cerebellum, this is our fourth ventricle. Everything under the pons from here down is going to be the medulla oblongata until we hit the spinal cord, right? So the spinal cord will pick up right here, but above in this general area, that's going to be the medulla oblongata. If we're looking at our brain model in class, there's not much difference either. It's just kind of just this general area beneath the medulla oblongata. Okay, and that's it. So I'm going to end it right here.